Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Angela Nwachi-Willig, Dean of Boston University School of Law, and I want to welcome you to the 21st Annual Pike Lecture on Health Law. This lecture honors Neil Pike, a graduate of BU Law from the class of 1937, and a distinguished lawyer who practiced law for more than 45 years. Mr. Pike was also an avid supporter of BU Law and a tireless advocate for individuals with disabilities. As a child, Mr. Pike suffered a devastating illness that resulted in his blindness. He was educated at Perkins School for the Blind, where he earned straight A's before entering BU Law in 1934. Upon graduation, he took the bar exam and placed in the top 20 out of 600 candidates. And ultimately, Mr. Pike also became the first blind person to be admitted to the bar of the United States Supreme Court. We welcome you today in honor of his memory. And now it is my honor and privilege to introduce you to our speaker this afternoon, Samuel Bagenstos, the Frank G. Millard Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School, and the Arlene Susan Cohn Professor of Social Policy at the University of Michigan Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy. Professor Bagenstos is deeply admired and respected for his critical work in civil rights, labor and employment law, health law, and governance. He recently returned to the Academy after a 4-year leave working in the federal government, where he served as general counsel to the Department of Health and Human Services from June 2022 to December 2024, and general counsel to the Office of Management and Budget from January 2021 to June 2022. In a previous leave from teaching from 2009 to 2011, Professor Bagenstos also served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at the Department of Justice. Early in his career, Professor Bagenstos was a law clerk to Judge Stephen Reinhart on the Ninth Circuit and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Supreme Court of the United States, as well as an attorney in the appellate section of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. He has expertly argued 4 cases before the United States Supreme Court, including Young versus United Parcel Service, which established new protections for pregnant workers, and United States versus Georgia, which upheld, as applied to his client's case, the constitutionality of Title II of the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. Professor Bagenstos has also argued cases on multiple occasions before the Michigan Supreme Court and before several federal appellate courts. Professor Bagenstos has testified before Congress on several important issues, including in support of the Fair Pay Restoration Act, the ADA Amendments Act, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, as well as on the application of the ADA to advancing technology and the problem of mental illness in prisons. He is a prolific and accomplished writer, having published dozens of articles in law reviews and other academic and public-facing outlets. His book, Law and the Contradictions of the Disability Rights Movement, was published by Yale University Press in 2009, and the 4th edition of his case book, Disability Rights Law, is soon to be published by Foundation Press. So there's a lot more I could say about Professor Bagenstos. It's a very impressive and instrumental body of work and practice. But I want to make sure that we actually have time to hear from you. And after his remarks, we'll offer time for people to ask questions. So please join me in welcoming Professor Samuel Bagenstos to the podium and presenting him with this gift as a token of our appreciation.
Thank you. Awesome. Amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here. And I'm just looking out at the people sitting out in the sun and figuring we all wish we were there right now. So I have an especially difficult task to justify our being inside on a lovely day like this. But this is just an incredible honor for me when I got the request to come speak here. And saw how many incredible people who I have looked up to for many, many years have had the opportunity to deliver this lecture in the past. I really felt unworthy, but also very much honored to do this. So thank you. And that's probably the most positive thing I'm going to say in the next 30 minutes. So just preparing you for that, I've become somewhat of the Prince of Darkness over the past, I don't know, 8.5 months. So my topic today is the trajectory of disability law and policy in the United States, starting about half a century ago and with a real focus on about 8.5 months ago and what has happened since then. And what we had is a trajectory that was marked by a steady improvement over many decades in equality and integration and empowerment for disabled people in the United States. And then a very stunning reversal in many significant ways in recent months. And it's a reversal that is driven by a rise that has been going on for a while, in a resurgence that's been going on for a while in eugenic thinking. And so I'm going to talk about that. Let me start with the positive story. So starting about half a century ago, the United States made a very significant turn in its law and policy toward disability, starting to move unsteadily but unmistakably in the direction of equality and integration for people with disabilities in the United States. So you see this in the steady development of civil rights laws. So we start in 1973, Congress adopts the Rehabilitation Act, the first nationwide general requirement of non-discrimination with regard to disability in the United States, applying to all federally funded entities. That then leads to, in Congress 2 years later, the passage of the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which is now called the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, a law that for the first time guaranteed that schools could not refuse to admit people because they had disabilities. At the time Congress passed that law in 1975, Congress found 1 million students around the country were being excluded from school entirely because the school districts determined that they were uneducable, and many other millions of children were being significantly denied educational opportunities. Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975 created this zero reject principle, required that every child with a disability receives a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. Incredibly significant legally and socially. 2 years after Congress enacts that law, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, the predecessor of the agency that I served, issues regulations implementing the Rehabilitation Act. If you've seen the movie Crip Camp, which if you haven't, I recommend you go out and see it right away. But if you've seen the movie Crip Camp, you know that the issuance of those regulations was not something that happened because there were good-hearted administrators. Then Secretary Joe Califano had to be dragged kicking and screaming to do it, with the then nascent American disability rights movement really rising up in protest, in organizing, in mobilization, occupying the federal building in San Francisco for over a month in order to get him to sign those regulations, but he did. That created the first significant requirement of reasonable accommodation and of accessible facilities in the United States. It's the reason why so many of our colleges and universities and schools and other institutions became accessible. In 1988, Congress extended anti-discrimination and accommodation protections to housing when it expanded the Fair Housing Act. 2 years later, in 1990, Congress adopted the Americans with Disabilities Act, the first comprehensive civil rights law for people with disabilities in the United States, guaranteeing non-discrimination and a right to accommodation and accessible facilities throughout the public and private sectors. And when courts started to read that law very narrowly, Congress responded to that during the George W. Bush administration, which I had once thought was the most conservative administration I would experience in my lifetime. Even during the George W. Bush administration, Congress responded by overturning the restrictive decisions of the Supreme Court and lower courts and adopting the ADA Amendments Act, which dramatically expanded the coverage of the ADA, restoring it in some ways to what many of the people who wrote the ADA thought it would mean, but expanding it well beyond what the ADA originally said it would mean and what the court said it would mean. Then, beyond civil rights laws, although including civil rights in some ways, we see other significant expansions. In 2010, Congress adopts the Affordable Care Act, which is very significant in moving us much more closely toward universal health care, but also which includes a provision, Section 1557, which is the first guarantee of civil rights protections in health care on a national level that we had adopted. In 2024, the Biden administration issued significant new regulations under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act to expand protections against discrimination against people with disabilities in healthcare in particular, responding in many ways to lessons learned in the COVID pandemic, but also new regulations under Section 1557 to expand healthcare rights and healthcare protections, and new regulations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, in particular guaranteeing access to web-based services where so many people are obtaining opportunities in society. So just at a formal legal level, steady expansion of protections, of civil rights protections for disabled people in the United States, and very significant decisions implementing these laws coming out of the courts during this period. In the 1980s, in 1987, we have the Supreme Court decide School Board versus R-Line under the Rehabilitation Act, which is a case that in the oral argument, Justice William Brennan assured the audience, I mean, this is actually a very strange thing to have happen in an oral argument in the Supreme Court. Justice Brennan, instead of talking to the lawyers, talked to the folks sitting in the courtroom and said, I want you to know this case is not about AIDS. 1987, it was a case, the plaintiff had tuberculosis. Everybody knew that the case was about whether the Rehabilitation Act would provide protection against discrimination for people who had AIDS. And in fact, the court did extend non-discrimination protections there, and that was a very significant step in both guaranteeing rights of people with HIV and AIDS to participate fully in all aspects of the community, including going to school, including employment, including healthcare services, but also was a significant step forward for civil rights law in general. The Supreme Court in 1998 applies R-Line to a case specifically about HIV, Bragdon v. Abbott, where a dentist refused to treat an individual with HIV and basically held that the dentist could not refuse to treat an individual with HIV. These were important decisions in helping to make the law an effective tool against stigma at a moment when it was really important to destigmatize HIV and AIDS. Other decisions by the courts also dramatically expanded the practical operation of disability discrimination laws. So we see cases like the Supreme Court's decision in Olmstead versus LC, the so-called Brown versus Board of Education of the disability rights movement, which held that the Americans with Disabilities Act requires states to administer their services in a way that promotes the integration of individuals with disabilities in the community. That was a case that involved two individuals who had mental illness and developmental disabilities who were being served in state institutions, state mental hospitals in Georgia when they didn't need to be. But that case then becomes the basis of litigation around the country and Department of Justice enforcement around the country that dramatically expands community-based services and supports for individuals with disabilities, various kinds of disabilities, psychiatric disabilities, developmental disabilities, physical disabilities, in a way that means that people with all sorts of disabilities can live full lives as a full part of the community instead of being locked up in psychiatric hospitals and developmental disability facilities and nursing homes and board and care homes, instead can live like everybody else. At the same time, we have significant changes in health and social welfare law and policy. So along with this civil rights law strand expanding community-based services, we have Congress and the administration across multiple executive branch administrations expanding the Medicaid Act to ensure that more and more people are receiving services not in nursing homes, not in residential facilities, but in their own homes, in their own communities. We start to see federal agency actions making home and community-based services not just more plentiful, but more meaningful. So looking to change the definitions of what it means to be services provided at home, not just living in a 16-bed facility, which back in the 1970s was seen as living in your own home. By the time you get to the 1990s, the 2000s, the 2010s, you start to see the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services saying, you know, that's really an institution too, and we need to be providing a more home-like, more community-like setting and set of services for people. We see at the same time the recognition that the way to solve homelessness is something we understand. Homelessness is a housing problem. What we need to do is provide people housing with supportive services that come to them through a housing first model instead of more punitive approaches to addressing homelessness. When we provide housing with supportive services through a housing first model, we can dramatically decrease homelessness and improve people's lives at the same time that we're actually saving money because we're not rounding people up and locking them up in jail for sleeping out on the streets. And at the same time as all of those approaches are penetrating all of our policy areas and being increasingly adopted, we see a dramatic expansion of health insurance, of affordable health insurance, of public health insurance under the Affordable Care Act, but also under a series of statutes leading up to the Affordable Care Act that after the failed Clinton health care plan start to incrementally expand publicly provided and supported health care. And during the COVID pandemic, expansions of the Affordable Care Act subsidies, which a lot of you now know about because they're in the news, but in fact, was a very significant piece of leading to, in 2023, we got as close to universal health care in the United States as we have ever been. 7% of Americans didn't have health insurance in 2023. Now, for my money, that number should be 0, but 7% is a whole lot closer to 0 than we had ever been because of all of this. All of the key elements of that progress are now under extreme threat. So let me start not with Donald Trump, but with the Supreme Court and lower federal courts, because recent opinions by the Supreme Court and lower federal courts are signaling a readiness to reverse these prior holdings I talked about that advanced equality and integration. And they suggest that the courts will squelch federal agency efforts to achieve equality and integration for disabled people. So start with a case that didn't get a lot of play, unless you're really a Supreme Court nerd. Last term, a case called AJT. In that case, which basically was a nothing burger in terms of its bottom line holding, Justice Thomas, joined by Justice Kavanaugh, wrote a concurring opinion where they suggested that only intentional discrimination and not the failure to provide accommodation is prohibited by Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act and Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So the fundamental legal principle of disability rights law is that discrimination includes the failure to provide reasonable accommodation. That it is equally discriminatory to say no one in a wheelchair can come to my facility as it is to say anyone can come to my facility, but you got to climb these stairs first, right? This is one of the basic principles. And you see Justice Thomas and Justice Kavanaugh explicitly saying they're open to an argument in a future case that these principles do not apply to very significant chunks of disability discrimination law. In a case, United States versus Mississippi, a couple of years ago, the Fifth Circuit disagreed with every other circuit to have addressed the issue and significantly took away some of the major tools that courts had used post-Olmstead versus LC to promote the provision of community-based services and supports that enabled integration into the community for individuals with disabilities and prevented accommodation. The court also emphasized the fiscal and federalism costs of expansive liability under the Olmstead holding in a way that there is a great deal of reason to worry that the Supreme Court is going to agree. But it's not just the courts. In the executive branch over the past several months, the federal government has been dramatically moving away from its prior commitment to integration in the community for people with disabilities, to housing first, and to other approaches that have been so essential to empowering individuals with disabilities. So I'll start on July 24th, 2025. That's not when this all started, but it was just 2 days before the 35th anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. On July 24th, 2025, President Trump issued an executive order entitled Ending Crime and Disorder on America's Streets. In that executive order, he directed the Attorney General to seek the reversal of federal or state judicial precedents, i.e. Olmstead versus LC, and the termination of consent decrees that impede the United States' policy of encouraging civil commitment. So he declared a policy of the United States directly in conflict with the ADA and how it's been interpreted, and directed the Attorney General to go to court and get those interpretations overturned, to move away from community-based services, to move away from helping people with disabilities live out in the community, and instead move back to civil commitment, locking up people with disabilities so that they would get treatment in state congregate facilities. The executive order also directs the Attorney General to provide grants and other assistance to states in expanding their civil commitment and institutionalization processes. So we're going to finance the construction of new institutions. It requires the Department of Health and Human Services to provide grants to facilitate institutionalization as well. And it requires the Department of Housing and Urban Development to end its support for housing first policies to the extent permitted by law. So this is a dramatic turn toward a more punitive, a more carceral approach toward homelessness, mental illness, and disability in general. And away from strategies that have proven both to work to eliminate homelessness or significantly reduce homelessness where they've been used, and also to promote people making choices about their own lives and living full and flourishing lives in the communities. President Trump has also attacked accessibility as a part of his war on so-called illegal DEI. Sometimes he talks about DEI, sometimes he talks about DEIA. The executive orders are, talk about them interchangeably. He's also gutted the parts of the Department of Justice and the Department of Education that enforce disability rights, and the parts of HHS that promote community integration for individuals with disabilities have also been the subject of significant layoffs and cuts, and that's even before the lapse in appropriations, which has led them to accelerate these cuts. And the Affordable Care Act's expansion of health insurance has already been significantly undone by the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the reconciliation bill that is the signature piece of legislation of Donald Trump's second term. And there are more elements of a great retrenchment in the provision of health insurance on the way. Wherever we end up at the end of the shutdown, we are likely to see some backtracking on the Affordable Care Act subsidies. If those subsidies go away, if the expanded Affordable Care Act subsidies go away, we will be at a point where we have less health insurance coverage in the United States than we had before the Affordable Care Act. Even if we keep those subsidies, the retrenchments caused by the One Big Beautiful Bill Act already move us back to 2010 after the enactment of the Affordable Care Act. So all of the progress that we'd made in 15 years, gone. At the same time, we see, and this is connected to it, we see the rise of a libertarian eugenic ideology that has taken hold over healthcare policy, with the express goal of ending disability and the clear message that those who are disabled have their own and their families' choices to blame. So it's a eugenic ideology because the idea is we should ideally eliminate disability by preventing it from happening in the first place or by hiding disabled people from view. And the amount of aesthetic language we see from President Trump and from the people within his administration when talking about homelessness, I don't want to see this ugliness when I drive around, right? That kind of language over and over and over again, I think gives away the game. The repeated depictions of disability as tragic or horrible by both President Trump, his Secretary of Health and Human Services, RFK Jr., and many others bespeak this ideology. So, we see this a lot. I think one very salient example is in Secretary Kennedy's repeated discussions of autism, where he said about autistic people, these are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. He said they'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never date. Many of them will never be able to use the toilet unassisted, right? This idea, first of all, which is just inconsistent with the many, many, many autistic people who many of us know and love, but also the idea, what did he talk about first? These are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. The suggestion that if you can't work or pay taxes, you are worthless to society, which we see over and over and over again coming out of the Kennedy administration within HHS, is a view that has a very uncomfortable resonance with eugenicism in the United States early in the 20th century, taken over by eugenicism in Germany, both before and after World War II. I really encourage everyone to read Dagmar Herzog's new book about eugenicism in Germany, both before and after World War II, really shows how, although in the United States we may have taken a lesson from that war that maybe we need to back off eugenicism that you see in the move from Buck v. Bell to Skinner v. Oklahoma. It took many more decades in Germany, both East and West Germany, to get off of that ideology. We're seeing it roaring back. But I also think there's something analytically and conceptually important about the kind of eugenicism that we're seeing right now from Donald Trump and from RFK Jr. So a lot of times in the United States' history of eugenicism, certainly early 20th century eugenics in the United States and around the world eugenics presents itself as a kind of communitarian ideology. So the idea is it's about preserving the strength of the community and the nation, and that there are sacrifices individuals might have to make in not reproducing in order to serve the community. And you see some of that in the focus on work and taxes that we hear from RFK that I quoted you earlier. But RFK's eugenicism also has something that is a very strong libertarian aspect. And, you know, I was just talking right before about Quinn Slobodian's new book about eugenicism and libertarianism. There's always been a connection there, but it is really, really strong in RFK Jr. He persistently talks about disability as something that is the result of bad individual choices, right? So disability as the result of the choice to get vaccinated. Disability as the result of the choice to take Tylenol while you're pregnant. Disability as the result of the choice to eat seed oils. Okay, yeah, so closed caption, that was an eye roll from me. Or other foods that are not approved by whatever, MAHA, right? All of these choices that disrupt your mitochondria. Okay, they don't actually disrupt your mitochondria, but apparently your mitochondrial disruption can be diagnosed from across a crowded room by a person without training. All of this is about disability as the result of individual choice. Disability is harmful to the community and something that should be extirpated. And that makes this brand of eugenics a particularly toxic combination. It mobilizes the fear and stigma of disability like all eugenics does. And like all eugenics, it's based on the ideal of a natural hierarchy of some kind. But here, it's adding the element of blame and fault to those who are at the bottom of the hierarchy, which means that the state not only should be trying to eliminate disability because it's good for society, but the state should not be working very hard, if at all, to assist people with disabilities, to make the state or society accessible to people with disabilities, inclusive of people with disabilities, because all you're doing on that view is bailing out people who made bad choices. So on the one hand, we have stigma. On the other hand, we have the idea that the stigma is really the fault of the people who are stigmatized. And we have the undermining of support for collective efforts to improve the human condition. And that means collective efforts like public health measures on which we all rely to actually prevent sickness and suffering in the first place, right? So one of the things we know, based on decades, almost centuries now, but over a century now of learning about public health, is that so many of these disability issues, many are just, they're inevitable, but many disability issues are caused by collective choices, right? So much that we know about, for example, how people eat is that it's not about their choices, it's about the food environment that constructs their choices. We know that we need to make choices together as a community to build structures that promote human flourishing. This libertarian eugenics idea undermines public support for that, delegitimizes that, and it's consistent with what we have seen throughout the last 8+ months, the gutting of public health in the United States, the absolute destruction of health assistance around the world, which has already led to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of deaths. And all of this is consistent with this libertarian eugenic ideology that may perversely create more disability. Okay, so I'm supposed to talk for half an hour, so I'm almost done. This creates, for people like me, advocates of disability rights and justice, a particular political problem because there's a short-term need to fight against retrenchment and in favor of keeping in place and bringing back those kinds of policies and policy tools and legal tools that have promoted empowerment and integration for disabled people. To fight against the rollbacks of things like Housing First, to fight against the newly punitive approaches, which are not just Donald Trump. Donald Trump picked up on something that's going on all around the country and that's been going on for a number of years. People like me need to fight against that in the immediate term. But clearly, given how much of this is driven by an underlying ideology of libertarian eugenicism, we need to work to build a case longer term, much more broadly, for a politics of solidarity and community, a recognition that individual choice always takes place within a constraining environment. And so when people, and this is not new, like this is everything old is new again. But it's a lesson that needs to be not just explained to people, but it needs to be organized around. It's a lesson that we need to create a politics around. We need to recognize something that for the disability rights movement in the United States is a difficult shift, that interdependence, not independence, is the essential aspect of humanity. And that we're not going to achieve everything we want to achieve in terms of empowerment and integration and flourishing for disabled people or non-disabled people, who after all will likely be disabled people at some point in the future anyway, unless we move beyond this ideal of independence and make the case that we, once again, that we need to come together as a society to be able to do the things together that we can't do individually. That means working to rebuild the public health state, which has been destroyed by this president and this administration, to recognize that health is about collective choice, and to do what we can to share the effort to promote flourishing with regard to health, but also to rebuild the structures that promote integration. One of the things that promotes, I think one of the most significant lessons of kind of the post-war period in thinking, post-World War II period, in thinking about bias and in thinking about discrimination, is the lesson that when people are shunted aside, when people are put out of view, that generates and reinforces stigma, that the only way to ensure that we have true integration is actually to make it work right now, right? So this is my answer to William Van Alstyne, who says the way to get beyond racism is to get beyond it now by never thinking about race. The way to solve the problem of segregation is to not just desegregate, but to affirmatively integrate, to make sure that people with disabilities and people without disabilities are working in the same spaces on the same projects together. Right, exactly the opposite of this looks ugly to me, I want to get it out of my sight. So we need to fight against that. And we need to think about disability rights not just as about promoting individualism and independence and seeking resources to help individuals, but as helping to weave together a broader web of justice. So to me, that is an inspiring set of tasks, but we are at an incredibly difficult time for it. And I think, a lot of us in the world of disability rights and in the world of civil rights sort of had this narrative that things were getting better. That everything in the United States was always a struggle, but things were getting better. I think in the world of disability rights in particular, there have always been these unusual alliances because everybody has disability in their family. That's why, at crucial points throughout the development of the American disability rights movement, we have seen Republicans and even conservative Republicans playing a key role. And I think the disability rights movement got a little too reliant on having allies and being able to expect having allies out there. And I think what we need is actually to build a case for and mobilize people around the country around the idea that inclusion and integration and flourishing for people with disabilities is inclusion, integration, and flourishing for everyone, and that we need to work together to do that. And that's what I will leave you with, that is the task for the period ahead. So thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk about this. And I think, yeah, right. I think we're open for questions for a while, right? Yeah.
And I saw your hand first.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. My name's Ron Wheeler, and I'm a double Wolverine, so go blue.
Go blue.
My question is, I agree with you, but we're at a time, maybe we never left the time when we don't want to include or integrate with anybody, really. I mean, we don't want immigrants, we don't want homeless people, we don't want people of color, we certainly don't want gay or transgender people. So how do we, I think the task is much larger than you outline. And I wonder if you agree with that, what the next steps are.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think that the task, I guess that's sort of what I was trying to signal at the end, that I think it has been important for the American disability rights movement in, the course of my lifetime to have a foot in the broader civil rights struggles, but also be a little bit apart, and to say, look, we're different because there's disability everywhere, because, we have folks on the conservative side who may agree with us. And I think what we're seeing is, there's no way around making the struggle around disability part of these broader justice struggles. And, my friends who are political strategists will say, well, that's really stupid because all you're doing is making things harder. And the way that we win victories in the United States political system is at the margins. And, these can be very useful marginal allies to have. And I think that is right in an opportunistic sense sometimes. I think what we're seeing right now is it's a very exclusionary moment in general, and we're seeing the limits of that strategy. And so it is a big problem and a big issue. And I think folks who advocate for justice, we're all kind of knocked on our back foot a little bit right now. And I'm not the strategist around that. All I can say is, I think you're right. It's a big problem, and we need to think about how we can all move forward together as a broader movement for justice, and that's what we're going to have to do.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Amanda. I'm a 1L. And I 100%, I've read a lot. I read your paper. I've read a lot of your pieces around eugenics and your idea around there's a collective responsibility, a collective obligation to do what we can. And what I'm struggling to reconcile with is spaces that preach that preach inclusion, that are preaching to go against the norms that we are seeing, actively violate that in so many ways. I'm just thinking about how obviously the government made it extremely difficult to get your vaccinations this year, which is part of our collective obligation to each other, enforce public health norms. And this university, other spaces bought into that, right? We've actually postponed our clinics multiple times. They removed the information from the website. It's become very, very difficult, right? Same with masking, right? There's a ton of literature explaining how helpful that is and how that makes spaces more accessible, and yet we've completely abandoned it. So I know that you talked a lot about the difference between personal choice, that we don't want to end up in that libertarian eugenicist idea of it's all about personal choice, but also what is our collective obligation to each other in a time where we are completely abandoned by the institutions that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, and I think that is, a big part of what's going on here. And I could talk for hours about like each of these pieces, and some of you have seen recently, I talked a lot about the way the the public health state has been destroyed, which is a piece of that. I think a lot of the story here is, we have this backlash to a narrative about what happened during the depths of COVID. And the backlash really fed this idea that we went too far. I don't believe this myself. I mean, I, in some ways, think we didn't go far enough in terms of, our collective response to COVID, and wrote about it at the time. But the narrative is we went too far in terms of imposing collective solutions on individuals, and people should be making individual choices. And I think what's happened is as that narrative has taken hold, and it's been very congenial to a set of political movements, we have started to see, and honestly, it's been very congenial to a bunch of people who, find it uncomfortable to, take actions that are individual sacrifices in service of the collective good. I mean, that's, individual sacrifices are uncomfortable. That's the necessary, that's what it means to be sacrificing something. We've started to see a real abandonment of an idea of collective responsibility. And I think you highlight two pieces there, right? One piece is just the abandonment of the idea of collective responsibility. The other piece is what seems like a hypocrisy, that there are institutions that avow the collective responsibility and then don't actually live by it. And, I think it's important, not to love our institutions, right? I mean, I love the people in our institutions. I don't necessarily love how all of our institutions are run. And I think, it's important to see that and see those moments as opportunities for advocacy and organizing. When you have institutions that commit nominally to certain principles and are not living up to them, that gap is something that can be exploited in advocacy. But it also is kind of demoralizing, and so I get that. But I think it is really, really important that, to the extent we can get people to see and get people to continue to avow in favor of these principles and then get them to try to live up to it. I mean, that's the only way these kinds of things ever change. And so, that's about what I can say about that. But I agree. I mean, you've highlighted one of the very important dynamics of the last several years here.
Hi, Linda McLean. Thanks so much. When you were talking about all this rhetoric about ugly, I was thinking back to a Festschrift I was at many years ago for Jean Bethke Elstein, who wrote about the ugly laws and all that. But I actually wanted to ask you about whether the anti-abortion efforts to use protecting fetuses with fetal abnormalities as a wedge to ban abortion, how that relates to this kind of rollback of protecting persons with disabilities and including them in accommodation, because there's no doubt that these restrictive abortion laws takes the view that fetal diagnosis is never a justifiable reason to have an abortion. So that might make you think you're going to live in a world in which we value all life, right? So that's one part of it. But actually, maybe there's inconsistent strands within the MAGA Republicans, and not all MAGA Republicans are the anti-abortion Republicans. But the other thing is, on the same theme of personal responsibility and choice, tomorrow in Family Law, I'm teaching Trump's executive order expanding access to IVF, but now there's this MAHA counter movement to engage in restorative, reparative, reproductive health medicine, as if, and partly that's motivated by hostility to IVF because it could involve destruction of embryos. So I'm just wondering about how some of these various strands.
Yeah, no, I think the abortion issues are really interesting. I mean, so there is a history in the U.S. disability rights movement. One piece of the U.S. disability rights movement in the 1980s is actually, coming from the anti-abortion movement. So it's, I mean, and if you think of important figures like someone like C. Everett Koop, who I think a lot of folks now think of as this sort of kindly guy with the beard, who's, dispensing medical wisdom. C. Everett Koop becomes a prominent person in the United States and comes to the attention of Ronald Reagan and becomes his Surgeon General because he was an incredibly vigorous anti-abortion activist. And he expressly tied abortion to Nazism and eugenicism in his work in the 1970s, and was also a very important person in moving the Republican Party toward promoting disability rights. And you saw that in various ways. And yeah, even through the first Trump administration, the pre-Dobbs anti-abortion moment, one of the wedge issues the anti-abortion movement used was trying to get these laws prohibiting disability selective abortion. And you saw a lot of the rhetoric around that, particularly fetuses with Down syndrome. And so I think there are a couple of things. I mean, one is there are some people who that is, authentically important to them. And those are people, some of those people would be very supportive of, and have been very supportive of, when kids with disabilities are born, we need to do stuff to make their lives full and flourishing. And for a number of folks, it was clearly opportunistic. And, we've heard a lot less of the disability selective abortion critique post-Dobbs. Now that they can just ban abortion entirely, they don't need to do that. They don't need to say, well, we're picking off the kind of most politically popular kinds of abortion to attack, or most politically unpopular kinds of abortion, or most politically popular restrictions. So we're seeing a lot less of that. IVF, totally fascinating, because if you legitimately believe that life begins at conception, then you should believe IVF is mass murder. And there are some people who believe that, but in fact, clearly not enough to oppose a president who said, President Trump said, I'm going to be the biggest defender of IVF you've ever known, and has actually taken some actions to support IVF, although there's this other strand there that you identify, this, what is restorative reproductive medicine, which as far as I can tell is basically just sort of made up. It's like a backfill. Let's try to figure out some way to be responsive to people who want IVF without doing IVF. And then there are other ways that people are doing IVF, but fertilizing fewer eggs, basically. But, to me, I mean, look, I don't come from the anti-abortion community, so I'm not the right person to assess people's motives. But as an outsider, as an abortion rights person myself, what I see is it looks like the large majority of that is really opportunistic and was opportunistic. And there are definitely a group of people who were really principled, and those folks can probably be a part of a more communitarian approach here, a more, supportive approach, but it's probably not a very big group.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm Kathy Zeiler, I'm on the faculty here. And I wanted to invite you to clarify your remark about the connection between libertarianism and eugenics. So
I like being invited to clarify. So is that so could I say no? I respectfully decline, or are you asking me to?
You are free to say no. You are absolutely free to say no. As someone who identifies, at least in part, with the libertarian movement, I know that there's a fringe of people who call themselves libertarian who believe in eugenics and are really pushing that idea. From my perspective, all the libertarians I know abhor this approach. And also, if you think about it, these folks who want to use government to do the work of eugenics are not really libertarians. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on just what you think about the real connection between libertarianism and eugenics.
Yeah, no, that's why I was sorry to like jump on the language, but I was like, when she said I'm going to invite you to clarify, I feel like I said something offensive, so I'm sorry. Because and there's a you know, the flip response is hashtag not all libertarians, but I actually don't mean to be talking about like an entire movement of people or, you know, even the entirety of the ideology. It's sort of not the way I think about either ideologies or social movements. You know, I think these are all very fluid things that are, you know, used and deployed in various ways and combined and recombined in various ways. So, you know, I think we can have a conversation about like how many people who call themselves libertarians also have these views. You know, how often do people who call themselves libertarians actually seek to use the state to achieve various ends? I have a feeling you and I would disagree on that second question a lot, that I happen to think when you actually pull the strands behind most libertarianism is the use of the state in various ways that is coercive, and I think it's sort of not coherent to have an organized society without that, but we may disagree on that. But, you know, from my perspective, the point is not to say libertarianism always entails eugenics or eugenics always entails libertarianism. Quite the contrary, it's to say this is a really interesting combination and it's a significant one right now. Yes, there are many people, you know, who I used to fight with a lot in what I'm now calling the before times, you know, who are extremely libertarian, who I used to spend a lot of my writing disagreeing with, you know, who I used to be debating against, who now, like, all we're doing is agreeing on how terrible are the things that are going on. And I look forward to the day when we can fight with each other again, right? Because I think that will be a better world. But then there's also this, and I think those are people who are, you know, for the most part horrified by the eugenic strands here. There's also this very interesting, to me, and horrifying strand of libertarian eugenicism. And that is what I was talking about here. But, you know, I think there are a lot of combinations.
Hi, Judy Brewer here, currently a fellow with UC Berkeley. And Professor Bagenstos, thank you so much for the role you've played in disability rights for decades, including in leading HHS's update in the Rehab Act, Section 504. And thanks to that, I can now go to a medical appointment without bracing myself to be asked for a do not resuscitate order, because some of them assumed that I should have one. And yes, I have had conversations with libertarians who are eugenicists and think that I should not exist. So I know that that's a pocket there, and that's something we need to deal with in society right now. And the 504 regs, of course, did many other things, including the tech side, and thank you for that. I'm really curious, looking forward, as you think about this resurgent of almost fuel for hate and for discrimination coming back against people with disabilities. And you also look at the acceleration of emerging technologies and AI that's often trained on incorrect data about people with disabilities. And now the data is even being taken down, or emergence of genomics and so forth. Yeah. Are there any comments you might like to offer just about how there might be amplified risks or things that the disability rights movement can help be vigilant about and push back on where there are opportunities? Thanks so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think that gets into some really big issues. You know, so obviously, I mean, different people have different views about AI. My own view about AI is, you know, it's been overhyped in various ways. It is changing many, many things, and it's going to change many, many things. And in many cases, that's going to be very good for human flourishing and for disabled people and non-disabled people alike. But I think there are also very great risks there. I think the problem is there are so many dimensions, it's really hard to answer your question, you know, immediately. I will say that the one kind of overarching piece that might connect with what I was talking about is there's a way that a belief in a certain power of AI has driven some of these libertarian ideologies and this idea that we don't need to have this edifice of governance that we worked to build over many decades anymore, because we can have an AI just do that, which to me is just absolutely bananas talk. But it is a belief that a lot of people have, and I think that has kind of underscored a lot of this. But AI is this weird. It makes sense because it's changing a lot, but also the belief that it's changing a lot is making a huge difference in society. It's so polarizing, and I feel like I can't ever have a conversation about AI because whoever I'm talking to disagrees with me about half of what I'm saying. I actually think AI has been tremendously good in expanding and accelerating drug discovery in ways that will help improve the lot of humanity greatly. I think that AI, also is being used in lots of other. I think AI will not actually replace doing lots of kinds of science that people like Elon Musk think it will. And I'm very worried about the equity issues. I'm very worried about issues of, fair treatment of labor with AI. But I think it just gets really hard to have those conversations. I think what we, from a disability perspective, what you care about in some ways is you want to make sure it's inclusive and you want to make sure it's accessible. And I don't, I think, as we've worked on these issues together, like the pace of regulation and response by disability rights advocates is always like 3 or 4 steps behind the pace of technological change. And so I'm very worried about the left behind piece there. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. My name is Allison. I'm a 1L. It's great hearing you talk. And I previously worked in government. I think we overlapped very briefly at OMB. And I'm curious about, you mentioned just how institutions are being decimated, a lot of the work, especially done while you were at HHS and OMB. I'm curious as to how you see it, assuming eventually that change does come and the executive branch does change over. What do you believe are kind of some of the more crucial immediate steps, whether they be regulatory or other work, that can happen, especially in light of these decimated institutions?
Yeah, I think, and I've written a little bit about this. I think that folks on the more liberal to progressive side of the ball are still thinking in a way that assumes that this is a conventional moment. And so when I have a lot of conversations with folks about, let's imagine a 2029, what does it look like? And the starting point, not everybody's here, but the starting point for nearly all of these conversations is, well, what's the next piece of legislation we want to pass? Or what's the next program we want to implement? And, that made sense in the lead up to the 2008 election. What are we going to do? Well, let's do a healthcare plan that's got the components that sort of look like the ACA. In the lead up even to 2020, what are we going to do? Let's do this stuff for, let's expand chip manufacturing. Let's do this stuff for the care economy, whatever. I think task number 1 is going to be actually building a new government. It's a Marshall Plan for the government. That's like, if you were today to go in to the government, imagine there's a new regime taking over tomorrow. We were like France, and we could have the government collapse, and then maybe I guess we wouldn't be like France, because France, they have a government collapse and then they have a new government and then that collapses in a day and then whatever. But, you know, if we could be like some other country and have a new government come in today and try to implement a substantive policy platform, they wouldn't be able to do it. The staff aren't there. And you have to figure out how to recruit new staff, but also how to recreate the infrastructure of governance. And so that's task number one. And I think that's really hard for people. It's hard for people to get their mind around. It's hard given the incentives in Washington. Most people in Washington are policy, you know, most of the fancy people in Washington who get the really good jobs are policy people, not implementation people. They're not structure people. They're not rebuild people. But that's what we need, you know? So, yeah, I mean, and then there's this whole we need to build a politics thing. The Biden administration had a theory about building a politics, which was deliverism. We're going to give people stuff they want, and they're going to see government works, and they're going to reward us for it. And that was a failure, right? Because the Biden administration gave people stuff they wanted. Government worked. And there were some problems, you know, like prices were too high. But on the whole, the Biden administration did what the polls said people wanted. And that didn't create the support for a robust state. So we need people, you know, again, who are not me, like I'm not, you know, this is not my training, this is not my experience. We need people to be thinking in a new way about how to generate a politics that's going to sustain, you know, actually investment in the community. But we also just need right away to be rebuilding the structure of government. I don't know whether we have time for one more or.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm a 2L. Thanks so much for coming. Kind of following up on that, I guess I was just curious to ask you, even if it's obviously an early stage, like given the kind of like arc of history you're putting on the horizon, but if you think there are people or places like putting their, you know, thinking cap or doing caps on and actually starting to do some of that work, and then if so, what that looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, you know, so there are a number of conversations going on among different groups of people about what, you know, how to rebuild the state, basically. And, you know, I think some of them are really exciting in some ways. I mean, if we weren't in this sort of emergency, like the opportunity to rethink a lot of assumptions, it didn't make sense to take that opportunity for many years because like it was just too hard and there were too many things to do. And we had a, you know, more or less functioning structure, even though there were increasing creaks in it. Now that there's, you know, the structure's been destroyed, you know, one of my favorite movies is the Star Trek movie with the Genesis machine. Yeah, because I'm sort of a dork. But I feel like we've sort of started to apply the Genesis machine, and now we're trying to figure out, well, what new planets, you know, obviously you don't want to apply the Genesis machine because it causes genocide before it creates a Genesis, right? And that's why Kirk's son is so horrified by the whole thing. But okay, I'm really getting deep into this movie. But now it's been applied, and we have to figure out how to rebuild something. And there are people having those conversations, but they're very nascent. And they should be very nascent. I mean, look, you know, this is the government we're going to have for a number of years now. Like, you know, the issue right now is, from my perspective, if you agree with my normative views, you know, it's fighting back on what's going on right now in the immediate term, and then trying to lay the groundwork for what's going to happen in a few years. All right. Thank you all. I really appreciate that.